A Great Argead Saga Alexine, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 22, Shattered Illusion. The morning sun filtered through the high clear-story windows of the palace, casting long, dusty beams across the mosaic floor. Regent Ptolemy of Illyrian sat at the head of a long cedar table, surrounded by his advisors and a handful of Athenian diplomats. They were discussing the seasonal tribute to be sent to King Bardylis of Illyria, a gift intended to buy another year of peace. Keep the Dardanians fat and happy with gold, and they leave Pella alone, Ptolemy thought, forcing a calm, diplomatic smile as he nodded to the Athenian envoys. Let them call it tribute. I call it buying the time we need to stabilize this fractured kingdom while the boy freezes in the north. The doors at the far end of the hall burst open. A courier, caked in the gray mud of the northern roads and smelling of cold rain, stumbled into the room. He bypassed the guards and fell to one knee before the regent, holding aloft a leather tube sealed with the Argead lion. What disaster has crawled out of the highlands now? Ptolemy thought, a sudden cold knot forming in his stomach as he stared at the royal seal. Did the Illyrians slaughter them already? Regent, the courier gasped, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with exhaustion. News from the Mount Barnus Pass. The Illyrian warband has been erased. Ptolemy took the scroll, his movements slow and deliberate, though his heart began a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He broke the wax and read. As his eyes moved across the parchment, the blood drained entirely from his face. No, that's impossible, Ptolemy panicked internally, his hands trembling slightly as he reread the lines. A frontier raiding party shouldn't even slow Bardylis's men down. How could a 16-year-old boy crush them? Erased? An Athenian envoy asked, leaning forward, his brow furrowed with diplomatic curiosity. You mean they were driven back? A minor skirmish. No, Ptolemy whispered, his voice cracking against his will. The report says they were struck down from the clouds. It speaks of iron spears that fall like thunderbolts. Chieftain Bardylis's favorite nephew is dead, pinned to the earth by a bolt the size of a man. Perdiccas has recovered every head of cattle and is currently fortifying the pass. The machines, Ptolemy realized with a sickening wave of horror, remembering the Syracusan engineers he had dismissed as a boyish extravagance. He didn't just build toys, he built a slaughterhouse. The council chamber fell into a deafening, suffocating silence. Ptolemy looked up, his gaze drifting past the terrified courtiers to the empty, imposing throne of the king. He had granted Perdiccas the northern command as a calculated death sentence, a way to exhaust the boy's resources, fracture his pride, and humiliate him against the superior Illyrian numbers. Instead, he had handed the Steel Prince a stage for a miracle. I tried to bury him in the frost, Ptolemy thought, a cold sweat breaking out across his neck. And he has dug his way out with a sword. The army, Ptolemy said, his voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of fear and pure fury. What is the army doing? They are not just following him, my lord, the courier replied, a spark of involuntary pride flashing in his mud-spattered eyes. They are naming him. They call him Perdiccas the Iron. They say he has brought the fire of the gods to the border. They are marching back toward Pella for the winter, and they are singing Argead war songs. Ptolemy gripped the edge of the heavy cedar table, so hard his knuckles turned white, the wood groaning under his desperate pressure. He realized the terrifying, inescapable truth. His minor border command had given Perdiccas a veteran army that now believed their king was invincible. The regent was no longer the protector of a weak, manageable boy. He was merely a tenant in a house that was rapidly being reclaimed by its rightful masters. The crown is slipping through my fingers, and I handed them the leverage to pry it loose, Ptolemy thought, his vision darkening with helpless rage. The legend of Perdiccas is spreading like wildfire through the streets of Pella. Clash at Pella's gates. The winter sun was pale and cold, reflecting off the thousands of bronze shields gathered in the central square of Pella. The air smelled of wood smoke and the copper tang of the returning army. Ptolemy Illyrian stood upon a high, gilded dais, draped in a chlamys of the deepest Tyrian purple, his face set in a mask of practiced fatherly pride. Below him, the veterans of the northern army stood in rigid formation. Perdiccas sat atop his horse at their head, his armor unpolished and stained with the grit of the campaign, his eyes fixed on the regent with a chilling, silent intensity. Ptolemy stepped forward, raising his golden scepter to silence the murmuring crowd. Citizens of Macedon, soldiers of the realm, today we celebrate a triumph that was conceived in the quiet halls of this palace. When I sent the young king to the north, it was with a secret design, a plan to lure the Illyrian wolves into a trap of our own making. A ripple of uneasy silence moved through the ranks of the soldiers. Captain Leonidas tightened his grip on his spear, glancing at the scorpion engines parked at the edge of the square, their timber frames still scarred by mountain travel. It was under my regency, Ptolemy continued, his voice rising with theatrical fervor, that the forges were opened and the new engines of the state were commissioned. I chose the high valley of Barnus as the anvil upon which we would break the barbarian strength. Perdiccas has performed his duty well as my hand in the field, but let it be known that the peace we enjoy today is the fruit of the regency's long-term vision. Ptolemy reached for a laurel wreath held by a young acolyte, intending to place it upon Perdiccas's head, symbolically asserting his position as the one who grants honors. Perdiccas did not dismount. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice low but carrying a strange, resonant power that cut through Ptolemy's rhetoric. The vision you speak of, uncle, was written in the blood of the men behind me. These engines were built in the shadows because the regency's halls were too crowded with Athenian silver to hear the cries of the border folk. Perdiccas reached out and took the wreath from the startled acolyte before Ptolemy could touch it. He did not put it on. He tossed it onto the mud of the agora, right at the feet of the regent's dais. The army does not fight for a design in Pella, Perdiccas declared, turning his horse to face his men. They fight for the king who stands in the mud with them. If you want to claim this victory, Regent, come to the mountains and hold the next bolt yourself, the agora erupted. It wasn't the polite applause of a court. It was the rhythmic, deafening shield clash of 3,000 veterans. Ptolemy stood frozen on his gilded stage, the stolen laurel lying in the dirt, realizing that in his attempt to claim the glory, he had only highlighted his own irrelevance. The blizzard howled through the jagged peaks of the Pierian Mountains, its frozen fury wrapping the old royal capital in a shroud of absolute dark. Inside the great hall of the fortress at Aegae, the warmth of the fire threw dancing, orange shadows against the soot-stained shields of the Argid ancestors. Gathered around a heavy oak table were the lords of the borderlands, men from Orestes, Lyncestis, and Elyria, who had spent years paying tribute to the Illyrians, while the regency in Pella looked the other way. General Leonidas stood at the head of the table. He didn't offer a polite greeting. Instead, he slammed a heavy, iron-shod bolt, twisted and blackened from impact, onto the wood. You all know the gates of the Orestes outpost, Leonidas began, his voice gravelly and low. 4 inches of seasoned oak reinforced with iron bands. It has held against battering rams for 3 generations. Last month it ceased to exist. The Lord of Elyria leaned forward, touching the jagged iron of the bolt. A ram? Or did the rebels leave a postern open? Neither, Leonidas countered. It was the king's thunder. Perdiccas stood 300 paces back, far beyond the reach of any bowman on the wall. He brought forth these frames of timber and sinew. When they fired, the sound was not like a bow. It was like the crack of a mountain splitting. The bolt didn't just hit the gate, it passed through the wood as if it were parchment. He looked each lord in the eye, his gaze steady. I saw the rebels' faces. They didn't even have time to scream before the breach was open. We didn't lose a single man in the storming. The king has found a way to make stone irrelevant. The lords exchanged uneasy, calculating looks. For years, they had considered the young Argids to be puppets of the regent. Now, they were hearing of a king who commanded the very laws of physics. Ptolemy calls it a strategic design, Leonidas sneered, but we know the truth. These machines were forged in the old smithies of Aegae under the cover of the queen's hunting parties. Perdiccas isn't just defending a border, he is building a new kind of war. And he is asking which of you intends to stand behind the king's iron, and which of you prefers to hide behind gates that can no longer protect you. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shifting loyalties. The lords of the borderlands realized that the Steel Prince had done more than win a skirmish. He had rendered the regent's diplomacy obsolete. The king's thunder was a call to arms that echoed from the mountains all the way to the heart of Pella. Perdiccas stepped forward, holding a simple iron dagger. I do not ask for your gold. I have shown you the thunder at Orestes. I offer you a border that does not move and a king who does not negotiate with your lives." He placed the dagger on a stone altar beside the hearth. One by one, the northern lords stepped forward for the Oath of the Hearth, an ancient and terrifyingly binding ritual in Macedonian culture. "If you lead the phalanx, we will provide the men," the Lord of Elamia declared, placing his hand over the dagger. "But if you fail us, Perdiccas, the mountains will swallow your house." "I will not fail," Perdiccas replied, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Because my brother is learning the soul of the army in the south, and my mother is reclaiming the heart of Pella. We are no longer a kingdom of pieces. Tonight, we are a fist." One by one, they drew their own blades, touching them to the iron of the king's dagger. It was a silent, lethal pledge. They weren't just pledging to a boy. They were pledging to a vision of a unified Macedon that could finally stop bleeding at the hands of the barbarians. The ceremony ended as quickly as it began. The lords vanished back into the snow, leaving Perdiccas alone with the fire. He had done what his father could never fully achieve. He had turned the rebellious North into his vanguard. The secret alliance is forged. The North is no longer a threat, it is the king's weapon. Now, hunched over a heavy oak table scarred by the iron points of compasses, the northern lords stood in rigid concentration around Perdiccas III. Spread before the young king were the newly unrolled papyrus maps of the frontier, delineating every mountain pass, every vulnerable grain land, and the narrow valleys currently choked by the winter snows. Perdiccas stepped forward, the bronze of his breastplate catching the long, dancing shadows of the fire. In his hand, he held a sharp bronze stylus. With a decisive, fluid stroke, he drove the metal tip directly into the heart of the map, pinning the jagged lines of the northern passes to the timber beneath. "The winter is our forge," Perdiccas declared, his 17-year-old voice cold, resonant, and entirely devoid of youthful hesitation. "But the spring belongs to our steel. The moment the mountain frost thaws, we do not deploy our levies to wait for the Illyrian advance in the trenches. We do not negotiate our survival with the coins of a regent. We march north with a single, synchronized purpose: to dismantle their strongholds and push their entire war host back into the crags until they choke on their own blood." He dragged the stylus down the papyrus, tracing a precise circuitous vector that bypassed the predictable roads and plunged directly into the flank of the Illyrian territory. "Lord of Lyncestus," the king commanded, his eyes locking onto the weathered Highland chief. "When the season turns, your veterans will form the left wing of our phalanx. You will hold the high ridge at the Barnus Pass, drawing the fury of their chieftains. Your lines must be immovable, the anvil upon which their vanguard will break. And while they exhaust their mass against your shields, Lord of Elamia, your heavy cavalry will sweep wide through the western valley. You will be the hammer, striking their rear with absolute kinetic force." He tapped the stylus against the locations where the heavy transport wagons were marked. And between the hammer and the anvil, Perdiccas continued, a dangerous, calculating light in his eyes. "The Aegae forges will deliver the thunder. General Leonidas will deploy the scorpions along the high terraces. Before the barbarian shields can even reach our pike line, these torsion engines will rain down 4-foot iron bolts, picking off their commanders and shattering their battlements from a distance their archers cannot pierce. We will fight them not with raw bravery, but with the cold mathematics of the wedge." General Leonidas crossed his broad arms, a grim, intense satisfaction creasing his scarred face as he surveyed the map. "The arithmetic is flawless, my king. For a decade, the high clans have fought alone, watching our herds stolen while Pella counted its coins. But tonight, the North has found its teeth. By the time the spring grass rises, the barbarians will learn that the Iron Regency does not merely defend a border, it rewrites it." The lords exchanged glances that were heavy with the weight of this new shared reality. They had entered the hall expecting a boy king to beg for their loyalty. Instead, they were looking at a master tactician who commanded the very laws of physics and logistics. Outside, the mountain wind rattled the heavy timber doors, a morning song for the old world of fractured tribal warfare. But inside the sanctuary of the ancient hearth, the air of the mechanized empire had already drawn its first breath. The blueprints were set, the lines of communication secured, and the secret alliance forged. The rebellious North was no longer a threat to the Argead crown, it had become the king's ultimate weapon. The storm had no mercy. The bitter mountain wind howled through the skeletal pines, sweeping vast blankets of white over the mountain passes and freezing the very breath of the three men crouching in the dark. They wore the rough wool cloaks of Highland drovers, but beneath the damp fabric, their fingers did not handle ox whips. They twitched restlessly against the cold bronze rings of Egyptian daggers. They were the eyes of the North Tower, the most meticulous spies in the employ of the Regent Ptolemy Lauros, trained by Parmenion himself to function like a silent, clinical ledger of the realm. For weeks, their mission had been simple: to record the predictable, bitter grumbling of the border lords. They had been sent to count the precise number of complaints, the furious gestures of defiance, and the growing despair of the Highland clans as Pella prepared the seasonal tribute for the Illyrian king Bardylis. But tonight, the arithmetic of fear had completely broken down. "They have not spoken a single word since the midnight watch," Mardonius whispered, his teeth chattering as he leaned against the frozen stone wall of a deserted smithy. He pulled his hood lower, his pale eyes straining to pierce the absolute dark of the street leading to the ancient royal hearth. The Lord of Lyncestis arrived at noon. He did not bring his tax rolls. He did not bring a single petition for succor. He rode in with his jaw set like an iron bar, and his captains did not even stop to buy wine. Beside him, Calchas, the most senior of the trio, was frantically reviewing a narrow strip of parchment by the dim, shuttered light of a small clay lantern. His hand was shaking, not from the biting chill, but from the terrifying void in his reports. "It makes no numeric sense," Calchas hissed, his voice a dry, ragged friction against the roar of the blizzard. "The Lord of Elamia lost 40 head of prime cattle to the Illyrian raiders last moon. By all the laws of his bloodline, he should be screaming for the regent's silver. He should be threatening sedition in the High Council. Yet, when he crossed the threshold of the Great Hall tonight, he looked complete. There was no purse in his hand, Mardonius. There was only the weight of his sword. The three spies had trailed the small hooded retinues through the blinding snow, expecting the usual chaotic assembly of fractured clans, the desperate value-seeking that defined the northern nobility. They had prepared their ciphers to record the exact price of their silence. Instead, they had witnessed a clinical, synchronized movement that resembled the closed ranks of a southern phalanx, rather than a meeting of rebellious mountain chiefs. "The young king is inside," the third spy, a youth named Aegae, murmured from the shadow of the timber eaves. "And Leonidas has sealed the bronze doors. Not even the palace hounds are permitted within 20 paces of the hearth. What are they calculating in there?" Mardonius pressed his face against the cold timber of a shutter, trying to catch even a fragment of the voices within. But the storm was a perfect shroud, reducing the speech of the kings into an unrecognizable hiss of wind. If they do not complain about the tribute, it means they no longer require Pella to buy their peace. And if they do not require our silver, it means they have found another currency, Calchas interrupted, his gray eyes narrowing as a chilling, geometric truth began to dawn on his clinical mind. He looked toward the darkened ridge where the royal barracks loomed like a dormant beast. He remembered the strange rumors of the scorpions, the heavy, timber-framed engines that had vanished from the Aegae foundries under the cover of the queen's hunting parties. He realized, with a sudden jolt of adrenaline, that the regent's carefully constructed trap had backfired. Ptolemy had granted Perdiccas the northern frontier as a slow, isolating death sentence. But the boy king had not bled. He had systematically gathered the broken shards of the north and pulled them into a lethal, unified structure. "We must send the birds to Pella before the dawn watch," Calchas commanded, his hand snapping the lantern shut, plunging them into the absolute dark of the Pierian night. "Tell Parmenion that the ledger is empty. The border lords are no longer counting their scars. They are waiting for the spring. And if the regent does not look to his own throat, the Iron King will rewrite the balance of power before the snows can melt." The three shadows dissolved back into the howling white, fleeing the ancient capital like ghosts retreating from a rising flame, desperate to deliver a warning that was already too late to change the mathematics of the coming war. The scytale code in Thebes. The pre-dawn chill of Boeotia was a flat, unyielding slate, pressing against the limestone walls of Pamani's guest residence. Inside the small, clean-swept chamber, the single oil lamp had long since burned down to a stubborn, guttering blue thread of light, casting a long skeletal shadow of the young Prince Philip across his writing desk. Philip did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his simple cot, his 14-year-old body perfectly still, yet his mind operated with the precise kinetic energy of the torsion springs he had studied at the Academia. He wore only a thin linen tunic, his shoulders broader and his thighs hardened by the systematic, brutal geometry of the wrestling pits. On his lap rested the Scytale, the curved Thracian blade, its cold northern iron, a silent counterweight to the marble symmetry of the city outside. The sharp, microscopic friction against the cedar window shutter broke the silence. It was not the wind. Philip rose with the godlike fluidity he had absorbed from the veterans of the sacred band. He moved to the window, his hand resting on the hilt of the Scytale. He unlatched the shutter just an inch. There, standing in the freezing courtyard below, was the young Macedonian groom who had departed with the morning tide weeks ago. The man did not speak. He merely held up a small, salt-crusted leather pouch, its surface disfigured by the rough transit of the eastern roads through Thessaly. Philip lowered a basket on a braided cord, hauled the pouch into the room, and latched the shutter. The absolute stillness of the Theban night returned, but inside the chamber, the geopolitical atmosphere had completely shattered. He broke the red wax seal with a clinical, unhesitating flick of his thumb. Inside was not a papyrus sheet, but a single, narrow strip of rough northern vellum, entirely blank to the casual eye. Philip did not panic. His training under Epaminondas had taught him that the truth is never found on the surface. It is hidden in the underlying structure. He reached into the secret seam of his chlamys and withdrew the wooden scytale bone, the unassuming rod whose exact diameter was matched precisely to the one held by his brother Perdiccas in the north. With surgical precision, he wrapped the vellum strip around the wood, ensuring the margins aligned without a single millimeter of distortion. He held the baton toward the dying blue flame of the lamp. The nonsensical jumble of letters instantly dissolved, locking into an unyielding vertical line of sharp, masculine Greek characters. The message was brief, completely stripped of emotional excess or familial sentiment. The mountains have spoken. Philip stared at the text, his gray winter eyes narrowing as the complete mathematical equation of the message settled into his brain. To any Theban polemarch who might intercept the letter, it would read as fragments of northern hunting poetry, a vague reference to the winter gales of the Pierian ridges. But to the Argead prince, it was the ultimate kill code. It was the blueprint of a total geopolitical inversion. The mountains have spoken. It meant the rebellious lords of Orestis, Lyncestis, and Elyma had finally been brought to heel. It meant the wild highland tribes had ceased to be a fractured threat to the crown. Perdiccas had welded them into a single, synchronized vanguard. The Scorpions had drawn their first blood. The mechanized army of the mind was no longer a theory on a wax tablet. It was a living, predatory beast, and its teeth were already sharpened for the throat of the Regent Ptolemy. A profound, chilling happiness flooded Philip's veins. He ran his thumb over the wrapped text on the baton, feeling the physical weight of his family's rising hegemony. While his masters, Epaminondas, Pelopidas, and Pamines, were preparing for their northern campaign into Thessaly to put an end to Alexander of Pherae's tyranny. The boy they were holding as a hostage had just received the architectural design for their own obsolescence. Thebes thought they were tempering a captive lion to serve as a bridge to the north. They did not realize they were providing the ultimate whetstone for a predator that would one day swallow Hellas whole. With a practiced, fluid motion, Philip unwound the vellum strip, watching the intelligence instantly dissolve back into a nonsensical string of ghost letters. He held the parchment over the guttering blue flame, watching the vellum blacken, curl, and turn to ash on the stone floor. The scytale button went back into the secret seam of his tunic, and the Scytale was returned to its sanctuary beneath his pallet. He walked back to the window, opening the shutter to face the pre-dawn gray of the city. The cold wind off the Academia bit into his skin, but he did not shiver. He looked toward the training grounds where the sacred band practiced their lethal music, then turned his gaze toward the north, where the mountains of his homeland stood like giants waiting for their master. The young prince smiled, a small, clinical, terrifying expression of pure intellect. He had been in Thebes for months, absorbing their philosophy, mastering their strategy, and calculating their reach. But tonight, the mathematics of power had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer just a student copying their weapons. He was the architect who had just received the confirmation that his own foundations, were ready to shake the world. The dark was absolute, thick with the scent of wet pine, horse sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of grease. Down from the high ridges of Aegae, muffled in heavy wool blankets to deaden the clatter of copper and iron, a massive convoy of heavy ox wagons rumbled into the courtyard of the Lyncestian citadel. They had traveled through the dead of night along treacherous goat paths, their arrivals synchronized across the entire western frontier, from Orestes to Elymia. These were the smiths and engineers of the royal foundry, men with soot-stained hands and eyes that calculated vectors rather than bloodlines. They did not arrive as servants. They arrived as the mechanized vanguard of King Perdiccas III, tasking the rebellious border lords with a reality that rendered their ancient stone walls obsolete. "Unload the long timbers," Archidamus, the chief Syracusan engineer, commanded, his voice a low, raspy friction against the freezing mountain wind. He did not bow to the Lord of Lyncestis, who stood under the torchlight with his captains, watching the arrival with a mixture of raw awe and deep-seated skepticism. The king's decree is precise. Every gatehouse along this frontier must be refitted with a twin battery of the refined scorpions before the spring thaw. We do not build walls to hide behind, we build platforms to strike from. With clinical efficiency, the crews began throwing back the canvas covers of the wagons. Underneath, gleaming faintly in the torchlight, were the dismantled components of the new torsion engines. The heavy oak frames, the bronze washers stamped with the Argead lion, and the massive greasy coils of braided horsehair and sinew. The border captains stepped forward, their hands resting on their sword belts as they observed the alien architecture of the southern machines. "These frames look heavy, engineer," the Lyncestian chief muttered, his thumb tracing a jagged scar on his jaw. "In these mountains, a soldier survives by his mobility, not by anchoring his fate to a block of timber. An unanchored soldier is an animal waiting to be hunted by the Illyrian cavalry," Archidamus countered, turning a heavy bronze wrench to tighten the primary windlass of a lead machine. "This engine is the oblique order made concrete. While your pike line pins their vanguard in the narrow passes, these batteries will sweep the ridges. At 300 paces, far beyond the maximum trajectory of any barbarian bow, these iron-shod bolts will pierce 3 men at once, turning their tactical mass into a slaughterhouse." By the dead of night, the courtyard had been transformed into a cold, efficient laboratory of war. The rhythmic, hypnotic thud of hammers hitting bronze pegs echoed off the limestone walls, a new and terrifying music for the Highland clans. The engineers worked alongside the local garrison, systematically drilling deep sockets into the parapets to mount the swivel bases, ensuring the machines could sweep the entire horizon of the valleys below. They were not merely refitting an outpost. They were welding the fractured fragments of the northern frontier into a single, synchronized defensive perimeter. The king's thunder was no longer a solitary miracle witnessed at Orestes. It was being systematically replicated across every pass, every ridge, and every gatehouse of the realm. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the Pierian peaks, the shadow of the first fully mounted scorpion stretched long across the valley floor. The border lords looked out toward the dark north, where the Illyrian watchfires flickered in the distance, and for the first time in a decade, they did not feel the freezing chill of vulnerability. They felt the heavy, unyielding security of the king's iron. The frontier had moved, its teeth were set, and the blueprint for the coming spring offensive was now anchored into the very stones of the mountains. To be continued in episode 23, A Faltering Spear in Thessaly. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.